In which pyramid or temple are the records mentioned in the readings given through this channel on Atlantis, in April, 1932. 364 series. As given, that temple was destroyed at the time there was the last destruction in Atlantis. Yet, as time draws nigh when changes are to come about, there may be the opening of those three places where the records are one, to those that are the initiates in the knowledge of the one God. The temple by Ilta will then rise again. Yucatan. Also there will be the opening of the temple, or hall of records in Egypt. And those records that were put into the heart of the Atlantean land may also be found there, that have been kept, for those that are of that group. The records are one. As to describing the manner of construction of the stone, we find it was a large cylindrical glass, as would be termed today, cut with facets in such a manner that the capstone on top of same made for the centralizing of the power or force that concentrated between the end of the cylinder and the capstone itself. The records of the manners of construction of same are in three places in the earth, as it stands today. In the sunken portions of Atlantis, or Poseidia, where a portion of the temples may yet be discovered, under the slime of ages of sea water, near what is known as Bimini, off the coast of Florida. And in the temple records that were in Egypt, where the entity later acted in cooperation with others in preserving the records that came from the land where these had been kept. Also the records that were carried to what is now Yucatan in America, where these stones, that they know so little about, are now, during the last few months being uncovered. It would be well if this entity were to seek either of the three phases of the ways and means in which those records of the activities of individuals were preserved. The one in the Atlantean land, that sank, which will rise and is rising again. Another in the place of the records that leadeth from the Sphinx to the Hall of Records, in the Egyptian land. And another in the Mayan, or Yucatan land, where the temple there is overshadowing same. The entity was in the Atlantean land, during those periods when there was the second egress from the land owing to the destructive forces that had begun to become active. The entity was not of the ruler class, neither was it of what might be termed the peasant, or the working class, but rather was it among the instructors in the activities in the land. The sojourn from same brought the entity into that now known as the Yucatan land. And in those activities there did the entity gain much in the making for the establishing of the temple worship, the temple service, the temple activity. Not in the capacity of what would be termed a priest, nor a king. The entity was in the Atlantean land, or in that place or position called Poseidia, during those periods when there were the destructive forces, and when the tensions arose between the sons of Belial and those of the law of one. The entity then was among the lesser priests, and a minister to the ills of the peoples who came for judgment and understanding. And when there was the egress to the now known Yucatan land, the entity was among those chosen to act in the capacity as the priest, or the minister of judgment, both as to the relationships of individuals among themselves, or one with another, and as to the spiritual and physical instruction of those people who journeyed to the land. The entity was in the land of the present nativity, in the early periods, when there were those activities established there by those from the Atlantean land after the destructions had come. The entity came to the south and west from what is now the Yucatan. The entity was in the land now known as the Atlantean, when there were the disturbances upon which those divisions arose. Throughout those periods the entity became, then that one that led the first establishing of the activity in the varied lands that came to be known as later the Mayan, the Yucatan, the Inca, the Peruvian, and later the mound builders in the northern portions of the entity's present sojourn. Not that the entity remained there, but established those activities, which has become a part of the entity by those divisions. The entity was in the Atlantean land, during those periods when there were the beginnings of the exodus owing to the destructive forces that had been begun by the sons of Belial. The entity was among the princes of the land that made for the separating of those influences wherein there might be established the journeyings to other lands, with the keepings of records, with the permanent establishments of activities that have become a part of the equal civilization in the present time. Hence we find the entity making for the establishments in the Yucatan, in the Luzon, in what became the Inca, in the North American land, and in what later became the land of the mound builders in Ohio, also the establishments of those activities in the upper portion of what is now the eastern portion of the land. The entity then was not only one skilled in aircraft and in watercraft, as an aviator and a navigator, but made great strides in keeping in touch with other lands through the forces of nature in the experience. Hence those things of nature that have to do with communications become a part of the entity's experience. The entity was in the land of the present nativity, during those periods when there were the spreadings of those teachings that had come from the lands from which those peoples came that were known as the lost tribes, as well as from Atlantis, Yucatan, the Inca, and the land of On. They were portions of the entity's people then, in that part of the land now known as the central portion of Ohio, during the early portion of the mound builders. There the entity was a priestess of those peoples that were part of the experiences there of those peoples. For while confusions arose from the tenets of the Hebraic as well as the Atlantean, as well as the Inca, these became centralized or localized in the expressions of those peoples and those groups in that particular period of their activity. Yet the greater blessings that the entity in its activity rendered the people in that experience were in the building of individual homes. And this will become a part of the entity's experience in this sojourn. The entity was in the Atlantean land, during those periods when there were the journeyings to many another land. The entity was among those who were sent as the directors to what became the Yucatan land, and in the setting up of the temple and the temple service, the temple of worship, the temple of differentiation in the labor and the ruler. Then in the name Ikunla, the entity made for a great service to a great people, that made for the bringing about of the preservation of much that may some day make for a unifying of the understandings, as to the relationships of man to the creative forces. The entity was in the land now known as the Yucatan, or Central America, when there were those activities by those peoples who came from the Inca, or the land of Og and the Atlantean land, when there were the attempts to re-establish those activities of not only the older portions of the Atlantean civilization, but also of those who sojourned in that particular experience. The entity was in the land now called the Atlantean. There the entity was a priestess, and the entity's experience there overshadows all of those experiences in the earth that even have an influence. For the entity was of the peoples of the law of one, and with the breaking up of the land itself and the beginning of the exodus of those peoples, the entity was among those that journeyed to what is now called the Yucatan land, or the Isthmus land. The entity was in the Atlantean land, during those periods when there were those activities that brought about the last destruction of same through the war rings between the children of the law of one and the sons of Belial. There the entity was among those who waned between the children of faith, or the law of one and those who sought the use of the spiritual forces for their own self-indulgences, self-aggrandizements. The entity was among those, though, who was sent to what later became or is in the present the Yucatan land, of the Mayan experience. There the entity rose to one of power, yet with those very wavering experiences, there was not always peace brought to the entity. The entity was in the Yucatan or Mayan land, when there were those activities that destroyed the Atlantis land, or that portion of the Poseidian isle or city. The entity was among those who journeyed to other lands, knowing much of the activities of the sons of Belial, as well as the precautions and warnings that had been issued by the children of the law of one. Hence we find the entity was among those who in the early portions of that material sojourn entered into the new buildings, the new activity that became destructive, because of the influences from the land of Og and On, and the activities that arose in the western portion of that particular period of sojourn. The entity was in the Atlantean land, when there were the breaking up and the separations of the children of the law of one and the sons of Belial, the daughters of Belial. The entity was among those who were chosen for the westward activity, and in the Mayan or Yucatan land the entity was a princess of the Temple of the Sun. Hence in the present there is the love of the beautiful, the love of nature and the outdoors, the love of the crude, though it may appear to some as crude, there is beauty in same for the entity. The entity was in the Yucatan land, when there were those establishings of the peoples who had escaped from Atlantis. There we find that clothing, and things pertaining to precious jewels, were of special interest to the entity, the decorative art, and this applying to certain characters of textiles also was a portion of the activities. The entity was in the Atlantean land, when there was the breaking up of the land, and when there was the journeying of those to the various lands for activities. There we find the entity first coming into what was called the Mayan land, or what is now Yucatan. With the establishing of the associations of many of the peoples, in which the entity was closely associated in the Atlantean land, in the Pyrenees, and in the Egyptian land, the entity was the first, in that period of experience, to cross the waters in the plane or air machine of that period. The entity was in the Atlantean land, during those periods particularly, when there was the exodus from Atlantis owing to the foretelling or foreordination of those activities, which were bringing about the destructive forces. There we find the entity was among those who were not only in what is now known as the Yucatan land, but also the Pyrenees and the Egyptian. For the manners of transportation, the manners of communications through the airships of that period were such as Ezekiel described of a much later date. The entity was in the Atlantean land, in those periods when the earth was being broken up, as far as the Atlantean land was concerned, and the entity came with those groups for search through other lands. The entity was among those who searched more than one place, to find those places to which there might be sent those who were to be saved. Hence there was a knowledge of the Yucatan land, as well as the settlings in the Pyrenees, as well as part of the activities in the Egyptian land. The entity was in the American land, as now known, during those periods when there were those who journeyed there from the Atlantean land. For the entity was among those who settled in what is now the Yucatan land. According to our information, the first major change in Atlantis took place hundreds of thousands of years ago. The continent of Lemuria and Atlantis broke up and the poles shifted. This left a group of large islands in the Atlantic, and in 17,000 BC a number of these broke up. This was the flood described in the Bible. About 10,500 BC the final destruction of Poseidia took place, and the people moved to Egypt and Yucatan. These migrations had been taking place for years before each destruction. All did not go smoothly after the beginning of the pure races. This is the basis for the purity of races, which has been so misinterpreted and turned to nationalistic purposes. The sons of God, the pure race, looked upon the daughters of man. Trouble continues right up to the present day. The entity was in the land now known as or called the Poseidian land, or Atlantean land, during those periods in which it was breaking up, and when the children of the law of one, to which the entity was enjoined, journeyed from the land into portions of what is now the Yucatan land. The entity then was a princess in the Temple of the Sun, or the Temple of Light, though others have interpreted it as the sun. In that land known as the Atlantean, during those periods when there were the breaking up of the lands following the destruction of the southernmost portion, in the first eruptions, when there was the journeying of many to the various lands. The entity then was among those who journeyed to that portion of the sphere now known as Yucatan. The entity rose from the small child then to the priestess in the temple there, and the entity gained and lost through the experience. In that land to which the entity again went, not of its own accord, known now as the Peruvian and Yucatan land. The entity then among those peoples that escaped from those persecutions in the Atlantean land, as well as from the upheavals as came a little later, becoming then a priestess in a temple that has, of the same peoples, recently been discovered in that of the southern portion of this present portion of the land. The entity was in the Yucatan land, when there were those groups and individuals who sought places of refuge and shelter when there was the breaking up of the Atlantean land. The entity was a priestess in the temple of the Mayans. Hence in the present all things pertaining to symbols, numbers, and things of rote, have been and are innate and manifested, and a hope and an experience of the entity. The name then was Shalmar. The entity was in the Atlantean land, during those periods when there was the breaking up and the journeying to the various lands. The entity was among those who came to what is now the Yucatan land, later journeying with many of those peoples to the south and west, or in portions of Arizona, as now known. Through the experience the entity was among those who made use of spiritual laws for material affectation, not so much in the abuse as in the negligence in supplying or in aiding others, that were of the groups of things, to attain to a greater awareness. The name then was Esdo. The entity was in the land now known as the Yucatan, when there were those activities, as various groups were being organized by the upsetting of the Earth's surface, as well as the various groups that had come from parts of other lands. The entity then was the leader in a spiritual and a material activity, as founded upon not wholly an empire, or that of a local nature, but the attempt of a unified work. The entity was in that period known as the Atlantean, among the sojourners from Atlantis who came to what is now known as Yucatan, and was in the temple worship there. The entity was in Atlantis, when there were those divisions and the breaking up of the land had been promised through the activities of the children of the Law of One. The entity was among those that chose to enter as leaders in what is now called Yucatan. And the entity aided in establishing the temple through which there was hoped to be the appearance again of the children of the Law of One, as they listened to the oracles that came through the stones, the crystals that were prepared for communications in what ye now know as radio. The entity was in the Egyptian land when there were preparations of individuals for activities in others' lands. Then entity was among those who were prepared in the temple beautiful for those activities in what is now Yucatan. There the entity may find much which would appear as a part of its own experience, just as it may among the peoples in the southern portion of this land, or the Indians who hold to the symbols of the ancients. The entity may gain much in study of custom, which may apply it in its own experience. The entity was in Atlantis during those periods when there was the breaking up of the lands, when individuals were apportioned, as it were, to the various centers from which it was hoped that there would be the spreading of the tenets and teachings. The entity became a princess in Yucatan. And in those tenets, and the temples that are even in ruins there, the entity might find much of interest, not only because of the tentative interest in the occult, but because of the abilities to organize activities for definite purposes. The entity was in the Yucatan land when the people settled there who came from Atlantis. The entity was a priestess among those who set up a form of activity there, being also then associated with records that were attempted to be preserved from the old order of things in Atlantis. The entity was in the Atlantean land, during those periods when there was the abandoning of the land owing to the periods of destruction. The entity was among those that came to what is now the southern portion of the land of the present Nativity, or in what is called Yucatan, then it was called Yuc. In that sojourn the entity was among those that aided in establishing there the priests, and the priestesses in the activity of the teachings of the peoples as related to the Law of One. In the latter portion of the entity's sojourn there, many of those lands now known as the Egyptian, then of Mu or Ra, came to pass the messages for the building of the activities, and of those things that made for the preservation of the thoughts and teachings of those people in that land. The entity was in the Yucatan land when there were those activities that brought the various groups from Atlantis, when the various upheavals of a physical as well as of a mental nature took place. Then in the name Yama, the entity was a leader, a teacher, an instructor. Thus a form of ritual becomes a part of the life, with those activities of orderliness ever about the entity, the neatness about the person, the abhorrence innately felt, and those who are slovenly in their dress, or the like. These reactions are sometimes good, sometimes bad. The entity was in the land now known as Yucatan, when there were those establishings in the land from the Atlanteans. The entity was in the temples, said as the recorder, in the name then asked. In the experiences, there were those periods of dissension with those in authority, when there were the decisions of most of the peoples to join with the movement in what is now portions of Arizona. The entity chose to remain in the experiences there. Records may eventually be discovered again. The entity was in the Yucatan land, when there were those activities from the Atlantean land, when individuals came into that portion to set up or establish new regimes from the lessons gained in the Atlantean land. The entity was with the natives, in the name Kuzan. In the experience the entity gained, and thus in those things from other lands, other peoples, other groups may the entity still find lessons for self, the unfoldment of things to be given to more peoples. The entity was in the Yucatan land where the groups gathered from the Atlantean land. The entity was rather of the natives, but able to embrace and to become a part of the general activities there. Thus becoming an associate or companion to one of those who were set in authority in the land, and thus the unusual reading of stories of adventure, reading of things which pertain to the mystical, all are of special interest to the entity. The entity was in the Atlantean land, during those periods when there were the gatherings of those in the various lands for the knowledge of the destructive forces that was soon to come about in the experience of those people in the Atlantean land. The entity then was among those who journeyed to what is now known as the central portion of America, or Yucatan, and in those activities there the entity rose to be one in power, from the abilities to apply and to use the physical things that had their import and activity from the inmost forces in nature itself. The entity was not among those to be sent to the Egyptian land, but rather among those that went to the western portions of the land and eventually to that known as the Yucatan and the Central American land, for in those sojourns the entity was active in establishing a development in the agricultural field, or the growth of those things that made for the sustenance in the new land. With the leavings of the civilization in Atlantis, in Poseidia, more specific, Ilta, with a group of followers that had been of the household of Atlan, the followers of the worship of the law of one with some 10 individuals, left this land Poseidia, and came westward, entering what would now be a portion of Yucatan. And there began, with the activities of the peoples there, the development into a civilization that rose much in the same manner as that which had been in the Atlantean land. Others had left the land later. Others had left earlier. There had been the upheavals also from the land of Mu, or Lemuria, and these had their part in the changing, or there was the injection of their tenets in the varied portions of the land, which was much greater in extent until the final upheaval of Atlantis, or the islands that were later upheaved, when much of the contour of the land in Central America and Mexico was changed to that similar in outline to that which may be seen in the present. The first temples that were erected by Ilta and his followers were destroyed at the period of change physically in the contours of the land. That now being found, and a portion already discovered that has laid in waste for many centuries, was then a combination of those peoples from Mu, Oz and Atlantis. Hence, these places partook of the earlier portions of that peoples called the Incal, though the Incals were themselves the successors of those of Oz, or Og, in the Peruvian land, and Mu in the southern portions of that now called California and Mexico, and southern New Mexico in the United States. This again found a change, when there were the injections from those peoples that came with the division of those peoples in that called the Promised Land. Hence we may find in these ruins that which partakes of the Egyptian, Lemurian and Oz civilizations, and the later activities partaking even of the Mosaic activities. Hence each would ask, what specific thing is there that we may designate as being a portion of the varied civilizations that formed the earlier civilization of this particular land? The stones that are circular, that were of the magnetized influence upon which the Spirit of the One spoke to those peoples as they gathered in their service, are of the earliest Atlantean activities in religious service, we would be called today. The altars upon which there were the cleansings of the bodies of individuals, not human sacrifice. For this came much later with the injection of the mosaic, and those activities of that area, these were later the altars upon which individual activities, that would today be termed hate, malice, selfishness, self-indulgence, were cleansed from the body through the ceremony, through the rise of initiates from the sources of light, that came from the stones upon which the angels of light during the periods gave their expression to the peoples. The pyramid, the altars before the doors of the varied temple activities, was an injection from the people of Urs and Mu, and will be found to be separate portions, and that referred to in the scripture as high places of family altars, family gods, that in many portions of the world became again the injection into the activities of groups in various portions, as gradually there were the turnings of the people to the satisfying and gratifying of self's desires, or as the Baal or Baalalor. Activities again entered the peoples respecting their associations with those truths of light that came from the gods to the peoples, to mankind, in the earth. With the injection of those of greater power in their activity in the land, during that period, as would be called 3,000 years before the Prince of Peace came, those peoples that were of the lost tribes, a portion came into the land, infusing their activities upon the peoples from Mu in the southernmost portion of that called America, or United States, and then moved on to the activities in Mexico, Yucatan, centralizing that now about the spots where the central of Mexico now stands, or Mexico City. Hence there arose through the age a different civilization, a mixture again. Those in Yucatan, those in the adjoining lands as begun by Ilta, gradually lost in their activities, and came to be that people termed, in other portions of America, the mound builders.